Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is Cullen Bunn. He's a writer of many interesting comics, including Harrow County, Deadpool for Marvel, and the X-Men. Cullen, welcome to Comic Culture.
Hey, Terrence. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's get started with Harrow County. It's a book about, I guess it's almost a coming-of-age book that involves those creepy sounds that we hear in the middle of the night that kind of put a chill up our spine, and yet it's a book that is very light and very engaging because of I guess the approach that you have to the characters. So what were you thinking when you were coming up with the ideas behind Harrow County?
Well, we wanted to tell a story that that has the trappings of a horror story. I mean, and there are definitely horror elements in Harrow County. But we also wanted to capture that sort of sense of wonder and that sense of fun that kind of surrounds all those crazy ghost stories you might have heard when you were growing up, or these strange rural legends that you hear about, and they're creepy and they're at times startling, but they still have this sort of this fun feel to them, and I think we did that mainly through. The story is mainly seen through the eyes of this character, Emmy, who approaches everything with this wonderful sense of the sense of wonder and astonishment and excitement over these horrible things she's encountering. And we kind of wanted it to be something just fell over there. See, some supernatural forces. We wanted it to almost read like a fairy tale in a lot of ways. It's sort of and that's how I started describing it early on, was a sort of a Southern Gothic fairy tale rather than saying it's a straight horror story.
Now, what's really interesting, and I guess ties into that, is the style of art that Tyler Crook is using in the book, which seems to be, in addition to pen and ink, watercolor.
Yeah.
Which is something we generally don't see in comics. It's usually those brighter, more saturated colors, and it's a very delicate storybook-like color palette that he's using. So again, this is something that the two of you are, I guess, conspiring on to give us as the reader.
Yeah, and let's just take a moment to talk about how amazing Tyler Crook is, because he does this all by hand. Nothing is done digitally for Tyler, and yeah, he pencils it, he inks it, he watercolors it, and he letters the entire thing. And I thought he was very instrumental, and that was the style he wanted to do the book in when we started talking about the story and the direction we were going to go with it. And yeah, it's mostly sort of these soft colors, this very sort of a pretty story in many ways. And then suddenly, when you get into the real supernatural elements, like in the first few pages of the first issue, the colors change and it gets very bright and sort of garish in a lot of ways. And you'll even see that later. We encounter ghosts, and instead of having these ghosts be sort of ethereal and misty, Tyler was really set on they had to be flaming and had to be really bright, and he really wanted to play around with the look of the book, and you can look online too. That he's posted a lot of time-lapsed videos of him doing everything from thumbnails to the final art. So it's kind of interesting to see everything just kind of come together on the page with him working on it.
And it's a beautiful book to look at, and I guess between the way that you're approaching the characters and the way that Tyler's approaching the art, it kind of lulls you into a sense of being a little comfortable at times, and then it kind of pulls you into that dark corner where we hear those sounds. And in our case, it was apparently it was Superman Blue falling off of his podium over here on our set. We have Haints. So again, as a creator, is this is there a risk in your mind to have a book that looks one way but twists another way, or are you just expecting that the reader who is going to pick it up is sophisticated enough to go along with it?
There's always a risk with that sort of thing. I mean, there's a risk in telling a story like Harrow County, which is kind of slow, and it's very deliberate in its pacing, and there's always the chance that comic readers won't stick around for that. As we're working on it, we kind of have a fairly good feel for who our audience for the book is, and we know they're willing, that they trust us enough to stick around for what's next, and I think I don't want to say they expect what's going to happen, because I think Harrow County is a book that really throws some real curveballs at the readers as the story progresses. But they know that, I think they trust us to tell the story, and to, we have to trust them to stick around with it, and they have to trust us to tell a story they're going to enjoy. And we've got this is a book, we have an ending in mind for Harrow County. We know where the series ends, and we're working towards that. And there's some stuff in the later issues that's going to be pretty jarring. It's gonna and it could even upset some people when they read it. But I think in the end it'll all make for a good, solid story.
Now, in the first collection of issues from Dark Horse, in the back there are some chapters that you had written of an actual prose novel of Harrow County, but with a different protagonist. I believe Maddie was the character.
Yeah.
So at what point do you decide that this would make a better comic than novel, and how do you get together with Tyler to sort of, put this idea together before you pitch it to Dark Horse?
Right. Well, as a novel, it honestly kind of died on the vine. It was kind of an experiment. I was posting a chapter a week online, and it just I got busy with other things, and I just couldn't continue the story. It was something, but that story was something that always kind of stuck with me in the back of my mind. It was always always there. Years later, I had worked with Tyler on a couple of issues of The Sixth Gun, and Dark Horse asked him if he was interested in doing a creator-owned book with them. He reached out to me, and we kind of pitched several ideas back and forth. There were a number of story ideas that we kind of thought would possibly work for Dark Horse. And really on a lark, I sent Tyler, I said, well, check this out and see what you think. And I sent him the chapters I had written for the book, which at the time was called Countless Haints. And he liked it. He loved it. The biggest thing he said was, he asked if we could change it to the time period. He wanted to change the time period from the novel had been set in modern era, and he wanted to change it to a 1930s era, because he thought that would give him some more visual, some interesting things he could do visually. And I was all for that. And that's really, it just, from there, it just kind of steamrolled. Dark Horse really latched on to the idea, and we went from there.
You mentioned The Sixth Gun, and you mentioned changing the time period from the current day to the 1930s. I was going to ask you about that. It seemed that you're playing with time periods in American history that are, there's less technology. So we're not, I guess as a writer, does that give you a chance to do something that isn't as convenient as taking the phone out and calling 911 when your characters get into trouble?
That is absolutely a benefit of telling a story that takes place pre-cell phone. That said, when I was writing it as a novel, I was thinking of places where my parents lived, and that could very easily, you go into that area and you felt like you were traveling back, 30, 40 years back in time. But the real reason was not necessarily to give us that benefit of the no cell phone benefit. Was because it would give Tyler something very interesting to draw. He wanted to draw clothing from that time period and vehicles from that time period, and I think that really it opened some doors for us that I wasn't expecting. I think it helped us with some of the attitudes of the characters, and helped us define some of the characters in some more interesting ways. It doesn't hurt that Emmy can't Google whatever ghost that she's encountering to figure out how to best it or to get rid of it. But that wasn't necessarily the reason we changed it from modern day to 1930s.
Now, when we met in Charlotte at Heroes Con this year, you had mentioned that your father was from North Carolina, and he would tell you tales of his childhood. And that sort of impacted you as a storyteller. So I was wondering if you could just, I guess, expand upon that a little bit. I mean, how hearing stories at home sort of made you want to tell stories as a professional.
Yeah, my dad was just always telling stories. He was never, he never aspired to be a writer or a storyteller, professional storyteller in any way. But he was always telling stories about, things that had happened to him when he was a kid and things that he had seen. And I think that I just picked up on it because then I was telling stories to my friends, and then I've always told stories, since I was very young. Um, and I guess maybe it had something, it was the combination of my dad telling me all these stories and doing all these things, and I was reading, books and comics pretty heavily, and I just wanted to contribute to that and tell my own stories, and I wanted to find ways to get people to share these ideas and these stories with other people. Because from a very young age, I was writing, I was writing and drawing my own comics, and I was writing a novel when I was in fifth or sixth grade. It's terrible, but I still have it somewhere around here, somewhere in a folder somewhere. It's a really awful novel, but I was always trying to put stories together, and I felt like it just was a way of contributing to that, to those stories my dad was telling. This is my way of telling those stories and sharing my own versions of those stories.
So you are a reader of comics, but the comics that we're talking about today are more, I guess, those kind of folk story comics, Harrow County in particular. But you've also done work for Marvel, for DC, with superhero stories. And I'm wondering how that sort of more action genre fits in with your style, which is, at least in your creator-owned work, is more character driven.
Yeah, it's a pretty. They definitely scratch different itches for me creatively, and if I'm being honest about my work, the superhero stuff is a little more difficult, and probably takes a little more work than the creator owned stuff. Not just because with creator owned, I don't have an editor who is. I have editors, but they're not necessarily making me, they don't have as strong a voice in guiding the story. In superhero books and, books for DC and Marvel, the editors are going to be a little more hands-on in the work. And different editors have different levels of comfort with that. But yeah, I think I struggle sometimes with just finding the right pacing for the superhero audience, and that audience is changing. I mean, I think, and that may honestly be a little bit of the stuff that's contributed to this learning curve for me. Because when I was reading superhero comics, they were something very different than what you're getting today. When you're getting stories that are much more, the stories in superhero books are much more character driven than they were, say, when I was a kid, and I was probably, at least early on, definitely writing to the comics I read as a kid, and I don't know that that voice translates as well to the modern reader.
It's interesting. I've spoken to a lot of the I guess the Silver Age writers and artists who say that we used to do things back in the day in 2 issues that today's writers are taking a year to do. And I guess that is because they're looking more into the character development and making the story have more impact. Is that a result of television and film's influence on comics?
I kind of feel like it has to be. I mean, we've seen television move into this operatic format, where it used to be, you get episode of the week and you could watch an episode and be out of the series and watch one episode this week and skip 3 episodes and watch one in another week and still follow along. These days, more and more shows have a continuing storyline, and those are the shows that I gravitate to. Those are the ones I like most, and I think it's just I think that's definitely impacted comics to some degree. I mean, the level of decompression is kind of shocking sometimes. I don't necessarily think about it too often, But you think about stories like X-Men's Days of Future Past. When I think back on that story from the 70s, it was a massive story. It was had to be 10 issues long. It was only 2 issues. And I remember I was hired once to write a 100-page graphic novel, which was the retelling of Spider-Man's origin in 100 pages. And I picked up the first, the telling of Spider-Man's origin, and it's 11 pages. So I was basically adapting an 11-page story into a 100-page story because they felt like readers wanted to take their time with it and really become invested with those characters.
It seems like, especially in your work, there is that more novel style to the writing. When I was reading Harrow County, I found myself sometimes skipping some of the panels just to keep reading the captions and the balloons. So as a writer, as you're taking that approach, how does that work with the Marvel style, which traditionally would be Stan Lee telling someone, okay, the Fantastic Four fights God, go?
Well, my scripts have never been that Marvel style. I mean, I think I may have written 1 or 2 issues of a book in that style, but never a Marvel book. I write full scripts for everything. So when the artist I'm working with gets the script, it's broken down by panel. They see exactly what text is going to be in that panel. But they're never really kind of thrown out like, here's just what I want to happen on the page, go. The only times I've done that have been at the request of the artist because they wanted to do something special for a specific issue. And then we went right back to full scripts after they got that out of their system or worked on that issue in that way. But typically, like I said, I write a full script, and the artist knows exactly what's going to text-wise is going to, at least what I envision to be on that script. Now, sometimes the artist will add panels or combine panels. So after the art comes in, I will usually go back through my script and sometimes rewrite some of the dialogue or the captions or move things around. Sometimes if I feel like something isn't clear in the art, I'll go in and try to use dialogue to make that a little more clear. But for the most part, when the artist gets the scripts, they know exactly where everything, at least where I intend everything to be.
Now, it seems like with the number of books that you're working on a month, I know that you're working on something for IDW now, and your own creator work. Now, we had talked before we started taping about it being a gloomy day in Missouri where you are. So it's not like you're working in an office where you've got the boss or the foreman who's making you get back to work. How do you keep yourself disciplined to hit all those deadlines, to get those stories written, and how do you keep it from just turning out and you're just turning out trash instead of the art that you can see in your head?
The non-artistic answer to that is the need to pay my bills keeps me pretty motivated. And there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, I have to, I have to produce work in order to get paid. I also have to produce work in order for other people to get paid. If I don't write scripts, the artists who are working with me don't have work to draw, and so there's a sense of other people are counting on me to get these things done in order for everybody to be gainfully employed. As far as how and then the keeping it from being just a grind and just sort of milling out mediocre work or work that I don't care about. I genuinely love what I'm doing. That's a big motivator. Is if I didn't love comics, I wouldn't work so hard and work as many hours as I do. There are other jobs I can do that don't take as much time. If I'm going to do something that I don't love, then I can go. There's many jobs I could do that would pay and I wouldn't have to invest as much time in it as I do comics. I mean, I work more than a 40-hour week. Maybe it's a little bit of a sickness. I work long hours and long days, and I work weekends, and I don't take vacations. And the only way I can do that without it becoming uh, sort of torturous is that I genuinely love it. I love telling these stories, and I love these characters.
It's interesting to when people start talking about being a writer or an artist, they always talk about the discipline that it takes. And I think a lot of people on the outside always think of it as like, well, you've got it easy. You don't have to go to the office. You don't have to sit in the car and have that long commute. You don't have to stand at the machine and make license plates or whatever it is that people do these days. But I know from my point of view working in television that there's a heck of a lot of work that goes into it that no one ever sees, and you find that you work a lot longer than you wanted to on something, but you have to get it right. So when people talk to you about being a writer, do you often get that, well, you've got it so lucky kind of thing?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be a writer. I have a friend who just recently became a full-time writer, and he's startled at how many people are asking him to help move, help pick up couches from the store, and help them with the projects around at their house and things like that. And he's absolutely right. You get that stuff all the time because people don't think of writing as a job. And I keep I've had to tell this friend of mine several times, you're just going to have to cut them loose. You have to just tell them, leave me alone, lock the doors, don't answer your phone. It's the perception of what people think writing is. They think it's again, I think it's a fun job, and I think if I wasn't having fun, I wouldn't do it. But that doesn't mean it's easy. Now, it can be tough, and it means planting my rear in a chair and sitting in front of the computer for long, long stretches of time. It's a great job to have, and it's a much easier job than a lot of jobs out there in the world. But it's still a job, and that's the thing that I think a lot of people don't necessarily see.
Now, it seems that with comics becoming more popular than probably at any time, with shows like The Walking Dead and the films of Marvel on the big screen, are there any plans for Harrow County or The Sixth Gun to end up on the big screen or the little screen?
Well, we'll have to see. I mean, the Sixth Gun has been under development at a number of places. They shot a pilot for NBC that wasn't picked up as a series. Harrow County is right now being looked at by Sci-Fi Channel as a TV series. They're working on scripts for that show, so it's a possibility. The book I did for Boom called The Empty Man is being filmed right now as a feature film. It's one of those things. It's exciting, and it's a little surreal. But I also can't think about it too much because I don't want to get so obsessed with it that it derails me from actually writing the books.
And is this something where other people are coming up with the ideas, or are they involving you in it, or are they just using your source material?
It's a mix. I mean, they have at least so far everything that has been kind of in development. They've kept me very involved, much more involved than I actually expected them to, so that I'm seeing scripts at every stage, and I'm offering feedback at every stage, including casting and things like that. But they definitely, in these projects, have been kind of spearheaded by other people who've worked in television or in movies, so they've had success in that area. And we've let them kind of take the ball and run. Although, like I said, they've definitely kept us in the loop more than they probably have to.
That's fantastic. So let's talk about your writing for different publishers. Now, it seems like you've gone from Marvel to DC to IDW to Boom to Oni to your own, I guess, Dark Horse work. So, is this something where you've got to work this all out ahead of time, or is this just something where you're a free agent and you can go where you'd like?
Yeah, I'm a free agent. Early on, when I first went full time as a writer a few years back, I was under an exclusive contract with Marvel, and that basically meant I couldn't basically, I had to work solely for Marvel. I had a certain number of books I had to do for Marvel. There were some carve-outs for books that had already been, talked to, that I had under contract with other publishers. But for the most part, that locked everything down, so I was working solely for them. And when that exclusive expired, at that point I could work with anybody. And there was a moment of sort of terror there. I was like, uh-oh, now Marvel doesn't have to give me any work. But I'm doing more work for Marvel now than I was even when I was under an exclusive contract with them. And yeah, I can work with pretty much anybody. The only thing I have to kind of keep in mind now is if I were working on several big projects for Marvel, and let's say this isn't the case, but let's say DC came to me and said, "Hey, here's a big project we want you to work on." It may impact my schedule with Marvel, and I have to balance those things out and talk to editors and make sure everybody's comfortable with it. I have sort of a nice situation where I'm not late on any projects, and I've never been late on any project with Marvel, so they can trust that if I'm going to do work for Boom or work on a new creator-owned, they never get worried when they hear that I've got another creator-owned project coming out, because I've never been late with any of this work.
Oh, I see we have about a minute left in the show. It's probably not enough time, but could you tell us how you got Marvel's attention?
Yeah, and this is what I tell everybody who asks how you break in with comics. What I did was I did a book for a smaller publisher. It was The Sixth Gun, and it was published by Oni Press. Editors at Marvel and DC read that book, and then they reached out to me. And that's what I tell anyone who wants to break in at comics. Do your own thing first, whether you self-publish it or go with a smaller publisher. You kickstart it, whatever. Do your own thing first, and if the work's good and it shows off who you are as a creator, other editors, other publishers are going to take notice.
All right, well, Cullen, I've been told that we are out of time, and I'm just surprised at how quickly this half hour has gone by. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today on Comic Culture, and I'd like to thank those of you at home watching the show. We hope to see you again next time.